Anyway. Good evening, everybody. You're all very welcome. Let me welcome those of you who are in the room here with us in the Long Room Hub and the people who are joining us online this evening. My name's Eve Patton and I'm Director of the Trinity Long Room Hub, which is Trinity's Research Institute for the Arts and Humanities. And we are working at the moment with the Centre for Resistance Studies. And the Centre for Resistance Studies is a relatively recent phenomenon. It was inaugurated during the pandemic. But even in that short lifetime, it has, I think, begun to reorient much of the research that we carry out and that we foster in the arts and humanities at Trinity. And not least has been the influence of this very exciting lecture series that the Centre has organised on literature and resistance. This is the first event of the new academic year in the Literature and Resistance series, and we're absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Ankhi Mukherjee for this event. Ankhi is Professor of English and World Literatures at Oxford. She is the author of several award-winning books, including What is a Classic? Post-Colonial Rewriting and the Invention of the Canon from 2014, Aesthetic Hysteria, The Great Neurosis in Victorian Melodrama and Contemporary Fiction from 2007. Edited collections include, with the late Laura Marcus, A Concise Companion to Psychoanalysis, Literature and Culture from 2015, also After Lacan from 2018. And this evening we're going to be hearing a little bit about her latest book, Unseen City, The Psychic Lives of the Urban Poor, which was published by Cambridge in 2021. And after talking a little bit about her work, Ankhi is going to be in conversation with our colleague, Professor Ian Robertson, who will be known to many of you as Professor Emeritus of Psychology here at Trinity. He is founding director of Trinity's Institute of Neuroscience and co-director of the Global Brain Health Institute in Trinity, which we're very fortunate in the Trinity Long Room Hub to work with in several ventures and enterprises. And of course he is the author, as many of you will know, of numerous books, both academic and popular. Those terms are not a contradiction, on neuroscience and on mental health. Unseen City, The Psychic Lives of the Urban Poor takes the concept of the unseen city, visible but not seen, from Salman Rushdie. And it's prefaced by in a very important and I think a very rigorous dissection of a discourse of psychoanalytical science, which has in its language, its imagery and its method regularly othered those who are, as the book suggests, not on the winning side of the colonial divide, and specifically the urban disenfranchised, the urban poor, despite Freud's own disquiet at the plight of those that he recognized as being too poor to afford therapy in the early 20th century. Where this book takes us is on a journey through psychogeography, addressing the work of free clinics and mental health provision across 6 world cities. And it does this in part through real-life encounter, but in part also through literature. And it was tremendously gratifying for me reading the book, as a scholar of literature myself, to see that Ankhi positions literary studies right at the very centre of the radical humanities. Unseen City, she writes, claims back for literature its potent role in the histories of humanism, human rights justice, politics and ethics. Literature, like psychoanalysis, can allow an imaginative rethinking of effective life outside the deformations of colonial legacies, the determinations of neoliberal governments and free market discourse, or the violent resurgence in recent times of globalized ethnic nationalisms. Well, for me, this endorsement goes right to the heart of what the Literature and Resistance series attempts to do. So let us now hear some more about such imaginative rethinking. Let me warmly welcome to talk to you, Ankhi Mukherjee.
Thank you ever so much for that very fulsome introduction, Eve. I'm very grateful to Rosie Levin. I was very fortunate in a different lifetime to have taught her. And she's as brilliant as she is nice, and I'm very glad to actually come back to the institution that is very proud and happy to have her as a faculty member. And thank you, Eve. I'd also like to thank the Centre for Resistance Studies and the Trinity Long Room Hub for hosting me as I excitedly talk about my new book. So what I thought I'd do in the next 30 minutes or so is sort of run you through some of the themes of the book, and also give you some case studies from the London section of the book to kind of in a way flesh out what my clinical engagement has been. I'm not a clinician, don't have a medical degree. Let me figure out how to, yeah, okay. The starting point of Unseen City is a historical phenomenon related to free clinics, improvisatory structures which tried to mobilize an international mental health cooperative movement. 2 months before the armistice at the 5th International Congress of Psychoanalysis in Budapest, Sigmund Freud famously declared that the poor man should have just as much right to assistance for his mind as he now has to the life-saving help offered by surgery. I'll leave the longer quote for you to read. Between 1918 and 1938, Freud's pronouncements on free clinics helped create a dozen health clinics from Zagreb to London. You can see some of the names of the clinics. So these were free clinics literally and metaphorically, as Elizabeth Danto states. They freed people of their destructive neuroses, and like the municipal schools and universities of Europe, they were free of charge. Ernest Jones, that's Ernest Jones, who was president of the British Psychoanalytical Society, was more conservative compared to the social democratic thinking of analysts across Europe in the aftermath of World War I. His ambivalence about institutions such as the Berlin Polyclinic was related to long-held beliefs about the medical foundation for effective psychoanalysis, which rendered the clinical authority of non-medical and lay analysts inauthentic. He found the spread of wild analysis alarming, Danto writes. This changed when a former patient of his, the American industrialist Prince Hopkins, donated £2,000 to set up a clinic for the purposes of rendering psychoanalytic treatment available for, quote, patients of the poorer classes. The London Clinic of Psychoanalysis, you see the image there, opened on Freud's 70th birthday, May 6, 1926, at 96 Gloucester Place in London, W1. In the first 10 years, over 600 people were seen by either Jones or Edward Goover. They were psychoanalytic cases, the treatment lasting between 6 months and 4 years. By 1929, all the members of the Psychoanalytical Society were nominated as clinic assistants, required to treat one patient daily at the free clinic, or an equivalent amount of service, and a position which was met with protests and attempts at variation of duty, such as members offering financial donations in lieu of service. During the Second World War, the clinic not only continued to function, it also served as an emergency center for psychological aid. I'll rush through the significant milestones of the next half-century. So the free clinic becomes part of the newly minted National Health Service, or NHS, in 1948. Wilfred Bion becomes the clinic director in 1953, revising the free clinic structure to introduce a means-tested sliding scale of payment. There's rising disquiet in the 60s and 70s about the clinic's function as a training institute for students. And finally, in 1990, NHS stops its funding of the clinic. So the London Clinic of Psychoanalysis, the original and Freudian free clinic in London, is no longer free. I had to therefore look elsewhere, and I found a multi-group based free psychotherapy program which is a powerful model for innovative primary care mental health services and challenges its privileging of psychiatric disorder over nervous sequelae with confused etiologies. During my research for Unseen City, I collaborated for 3 years. Actually, it's longer than that because I'm still talking to them and I'm presenting at the British Psychoanalytic Society conference this year with them. So 3 years with the Tavistock Trust, a not-for-profit, that's the Tavistock Trust behind this imposing statue of Sigmund Freud. It's not very far from Freud's last home where he died, in Maresfield Gardens. It's a not-for-profit public benefit corporation which provides over half of all NHS mental health provision. The outpost of Tavistock that I worked with is titled PCPCS, the City and Hackney Primary Care Psychotherapy Consultation Service, and it's an innovative free mental health service that's provided by Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation Trust. The PCPCS team, based in St Leonard's Hospital in Hackney, supports general practitioners, GPs as we call them, throughout the London boroughs of City and Hackney in the management of patients with complex needs. And these complex needs include MUS, or medically unexplained symptoms, which the St Leonard's Hospital team prefer to call medically untold stories. And what might these be? So personality disorders, PTSD associated with childhood abuse, chronic or severe mental illness. Because of the complexity, the needs of patients supported by PCPCS do not map into existing structures of service provision. Historically, patients in this category have also tended to resist the mental health rubric because of social and cultural stigma. As a result, they remain within primary care for treatment as long as they're able, the intractability of their problems causing vexation to GPs and other practice staff. Julian Stern, head of psychiatry at the Tavistock and Portman Trust, points out that medical psychotherapy in the NHS has been predominantly psychoanalytic in orientation. I keep coming back to the question of psychoanalysis because I always imagine this sort of irascible reader saying that your book is not about psychoanalysis at all, it's about different kinds of watered down psychotherapy. So this is my way of coming back, looping back to that question. So he says that medical psychotherapy in the NHS has been predominantly psychoanalytic until a little over a decade ago. Almost all consultant psychiatrists in psychotherapy were trained in psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic psychotherapy. Psychotherapy in the public sector in the UK has been influenced by European psychoanalysis as well as US and Russia-led behaviorism. With the rise of cognitive behavioral therapy and briefer forms of therapy designed to lend themselves to supposedly scientific modes of assessing clinical effectiveness, psychotherapy departments with a more psychodynamic focus have been under substantial threat, closing down or forced to gravitate to brief and manualized forms of therapy with a limited number of sessions. Stern points out that while psychoanalysis has continued to flourish in the UK and while psychotherapists in the public sector have psychoanalytic training, the profession itself has valorized individual, intense, analytic work over giving back to the community. Consequently, practitioners trained in EBM or evidence-based medicine, such as CBT and briefer therapies, could be seen in the forefront of work with marginalized and impoverished groups. By the mid-1990s, CBT was the most widely used psychological therapy throughout NHS. Recent scholarship by Lixenring, Rabin, Klein, Coelen, etc. has not only valorized the efficacy of psychodynamic psychotherapy for complex mental disorders, but also challenged the hegemony of evidence-based medicine by demonstrating how the analytical tradition of psychoanalysis stands up to empirical interrogation. The PCPCS interventions reflect both the popularity of EBM and the concomitant resurgence of psychoanalytically informed models. Their methods are varied, including dynamic interpersonal therapy, mentalization-based therapy, CBT, supportive therapy, couple work, and even mindfulness. Stern points out that applied psychoanalytic and systemic concepts strongly influence the service model, not only in its implementation, but also in terms of its philosophical underpinnings. So what Stern and his co-authors mean by this is that the service approach is governed by principles such as the centrality of relationships in human development and mental health, the role of transference, the ability to tolerate uncertainty, and the focus on the person and their mental landscape. My collaboration with the Tavistock led me to, via a garden path, to a horticultural psychotherapy group run by two Turkish analysts, Ahmet Kaglar and Selçuk Birilgan. Birilgan is a psychodynamic psychotherapist, while Kaglar, who is also the community project group therapist, is an integrative psychotherapist. The participants in this group, which meets in St. Mary's Garden, Hackney, once weekly over the 4 seasons of the year, are Turkish. They've experienced at least one major trauma in their lives: domestic abuse, political torture, complex multiple loss, severe poverty and deprivation. They're all migrants, most of them victims of trafficking, who've had to endure perilous journeys to arrive at the United Kingdom 20 or 30 years ago. They have no formal education, many of them illiterate in their own language. Most of them were menial laborers in Turkey, unable to work now because of the onset of psychosomatic presentations. The Turkish-speaking group is Turkish, Kurdish, or Turkish Cypriot. Hackney is one of the top 3 London boroughs with the largest Turkish-born community. The Cypriots arrived in the 1930s as Commonwealth citizens. The Turkish migrants from the mainland came to London in the 1970s and 80s due to complex economic and political reasons. The Kurds, a stateless nation and one of the most persecuted ethnic minorities of our times, fled persecution in Turkey, Iran, and Iraq in the late 80s and early 90s. According to statistics provided by the DEMA report, a community-based survey conducted by the Social Policy Research Centre at Middlesex University in 2013, Turkish and Kurdish adults in Hackney, Haringey, or Enfield were twice as likely to be unemployed than the general population. Unemployment rates, social housing levels, and the proportion of those never having worked or long-term unemployed could be twice as high as the citywide average. For Turkish-born people, the unemployment rate was 7% against 4% of the whole population, and the proportion of income support claimants 21%, which is 5 times the national average of 4%. Of the Turkish-born who were employed, the average annual income was around £14,000 against the national average of £21,000. I have more statistics about the female population in the Turkish community. We can come back to it later on, because most of the participants in this horticultural group are women. The Turkish-speaking group therapist Selçuk Birilgan, who was instrumental in designing the program's initial intervention, started by liaising with the community, with GPs and referrers, as well as mental health professionals with experience in working for, this is a category, difficult to reach populations. The program also contacted Grow to Grow, a social enterprise that treated people with complex mental illness through horticulture and cooking. The term horticultural therapy describes gardening as well as the therapeutic approach, which combines group therapy with gardening. And in what follows, I will focus on the activities of this group in St. Mary's Garden, Secret Garden, which I shadowed, the community space to which the group moved in 2017. It started in Spitalfields City Farm. The regeneration of the plant world lends itself well to projects of psychic repair. As it says on the PCPCS website, the heat and toxicity of trauma are moderated. The genesis of horticultural psychotherapy is often thought to be Freudian, related to the misattributed quote, "Flowers have neither emotions nor conflicts." But the illusion of having made something happen is more Winnicottian in provenance. Winnicott, who was a pediatrician and a psychoanalyst, maintained that when there is a coincidence between something conjured up in the child's imagination and a real-life event, it fosters a sense of self-belief, which in turn prepares us for disappointments in later life. Moreover, in Through Pediatrics to Psychoanalysis, this is Winnicott's 1958 book, he introduced the idea of transitional space, the hyphenation between internal and external reality, which he described as a resting place for the individual, engaged in the perpetual human task of keeping inner and outer reality as separated yet interrelated. The square foot system of gardening makes it feel manageable, while proximity to the earth and community through shared learning provides attachment security. The therapists posit the garden as a Winnicottian third space, an intermediate area of experiencing, where a gradual differentiation between subjectivity and objectivity may commence. The program, as I have said, lasts for about 12 months. A day's gardening, pruning, propagating new plants, seed saving, designing flower beds, clearing flower beds once a week, is followed by a 1-hour meeting over tea in the garden shed, where rules are revisited for newcomers and expectations of members reiterated as required. To mobilize the group mind, it's important to maintain regularity with the timing of the meetings, including time boundaries and breaks, the therapists insist. There's no formal agenda on the table, and conversation is unrehearsed, free-flowing in the best of times. They're able to say in a group what individuals wouldn't be able to say, Kagla states. Harsher divisions of religion and culture are not apparent in the group, which is predicated on self-disclosure and interpersonal support. The seasonal variations aid the growth and maturation of relationships between strangers, many of whom are incapacitated by the violence of familial relationships indoors. The therapists provide continuity between sessions by recalling old discussions and integrating the same with new and different outlooks. Every 6 months, the produce is cooked in the shed and feasted on. The therapists take pains to create a safe space for the participants. This, they say, is not simply a removal of threat, but it draws on unique cues in the environment, how we speak, how we look, how we listen. In the group setting, therefore, we aim to recognize the patient's autonomic state and regulate or co-regulate into their ventral vagal state, which is a safe, connected, social and resourceful state to work and communicate. Kagla says this. The therapists also borrow from the toolkit of emotion-focused and experiential psychodynamic therapies. Their most recent report mentions intensive short-term dynamic psychotherapy, accelerated experiential dynamic psychotherapy, which work with triangles of conflicts, the relationship between anxiety, defense, and feelings, and also triangles of person, the relationship between analyst, analysand, and people from the patient's past or present. In the group setting, these are deployed in interactive ways. The modalities demonstrate how defenses work and prevent us from connecting with our feelings. The price of not connecting is the psychosomatic or medically unexplained symptom. Emphasizing the experiential aspect of this mode of green therapy, Kagla says that the focus is always on the here, this, now, rather than the there, that, then. The feedback from patients in this group provides new insights into this form of ecotherapy. When asked if the group helped them change the way they had hoped, the 8 patients interviewed reminisce about the panoply of symptoms that had brought them to PCPCS: fainting, nervous collapses, inability to get out of the house or have social interactions, neuralgic pain, separation anxiety, and debilitating codependence. I'm much better with my emotions, patient 5 says, while patient 7 says, I express myself more comfortably. It did help me, I gained self-confidence, she says. More than half of the patients acknowledge the salutary effects of working in and as a collective. To see other people feels like family bonding, patient 1 states, while patient 6 states that the group has helped her self-sufficiency in that she no longer expects others to provide solutions for her problems. I realized that I always thought of other people in my life in order not to hurt them, but I was hurt. I started to think, patient 6 says, about my own needs. The responses to the questionnaire also reveal the ambivalences group psychotherapy may generate. Patient 1 says, it sometimes makes her feel worse, especially when she has flashbacks of the children's home where she grew up. Patient 3 complains that she can't express herself freely, as this was a cultural group where she knew a few people. For the most part, however, mutual identifications among the members provide relief for feelings of isolation and estrangement. I noticed that some people are unwell, patient 8 says, while patient 3 says that exposure to this group has brought her the realization that compared to her fellows, my situation is better than theirs. Patient 7 reveals of the group configuration that I was introverted. I opened up more. Although her pains did not ease in the course of the therapy, patient 7 says, the conversations in the group made me think about myself and value myself more. The group needs in relation to time-bound tasks made several patients feel that they had become organized and tidy in their emotion management. As patient 5 states, I'm now doing more things during the day. I get up early. I was all over the place before. I can cope with my pain better. Patient 2 compares the budding friendships in the group to working in the garden to grow crops. Growing things is very important, patient 8 emphasizes, echoing patient 3 who said the garden produce we grow is meaningful. Patient 8, who had mentioned earlier in the questionnaire that her mind was confused, prone to forgetfulness, says, I grew vegetables for the first time and now I grow things in my garden. To see the seeds we sow grow as vegetables gave me hope, says patient 3, mentioning in the same breath that going out on her own once a week helped her self-esteem. Patient 4 states on the questionnaire that I was fearful with the idea of seeing a psychologist before. Speaking the same language was useful. Gardening, she says, made me feel I achieved something. It felt good. It affected my relationship with others. Thank you, Mr. Ahmed, patient 6 states. Ahmed is Ahmed Kegler. Mr. Ahmed provided a balanced group. He tries to be just and he approaches us with patience and care. The victim-victimizer binary in trauma groups is diffused through the movable feast of conversation, a word that comes up again and again. The role of the therapist, the answers of the questionnaire suggest, has been to contain the projections. I feel like the motherless Prince Harry, one of them had said. Chalk out action plans, work with dissociative defenses and refocus the patient on the present day. Activate the isomorphic relationship between the divided self and the homogeneous yet non-identical group. In his interviews with me, Kagler talked about a different patient, E. She had been in therapy with 7 different clinicians for as many years. One of them described her as a crying baby who cannot be pacified. E was so irascible that she had been banned from Turkish community groups, and there's a gamut of pathological symptoms that she presents: headache, dizziness, mood changes, restlessness, insomnia, depression, anxiety. He also talked constantly about her relationship troubles, her poor living conditions, and her inordinate anxiety about the health of her children. She feared in particular that her mother's psychiatric history would be transmitted to her children. He had confided in Kagler about witnessing a murder, about the violent tribulations of the traffic journey to the UK, and the protracted process through which she was granted asylum. It was a big effort for E to come to the garden, Kagler says. The transition wasn't smooth. She would moan in Turkish or Kurdish, refuse to cook, pleading a headache, and the therapists were taken aback by the rage she seemed to incite in the otherwise docile group. E was eventually helped by the gardening project. The transitional space of the garden encouraged her to become more self-reflexive and confront traumatic memories of childhood abuse, preceding the brutalizing period of being trafficked and languishing in halfway houses as an asylum seeker. Surprisingly enough, her disruptive presence also had had the salutary effect of galvanizing the group, and they found it in their hearts to reach out to her. She became capable of the projective identification Freud said was crucial to maintaining psychoanalysis, capable of transference, in other words, and the therapists in turn were enabled to use this analytic tool to better treat the patient. Another study involves a man, S, age 48, who lives in a hostel in London. It's a rare case of failure in the history of PCPCS, and a telling one at that. S was raised in foster homes after his mother died in his infancy. Kagler gathers from their conversations that he joined military service after emerging from foster care around age 20, but this is unverifiable. S is filthy, reeks of alcohol, and is hopeless in day-to-day interactions. He keeps saying, I'm puzzled. His relationship with the horticulture group is not easy, yet S is very anxious about severing ties with the group. Kagler decides to go to his hostel to check on him when he doesn't turn up to the meetings. The room is small and fetid with no personal mementos or pictures to be seen. S talks for the first time about his hallucinations. He sees a man by his bed, about the recurring pain from a hernia operation he had had some years ago, and the time when he had to be hospitalized after a brutal attack on the streets. Ahmed arranges a caseworker, a Turkish woman, S wants to, but this does not lead to any perceivable change in his behavior. S fails to turn up to the garden as before. His physical and psychic pain is so unprocessed, Ahmed Kagla writes in his case notes, that it has impacted his capacity to attach. The group feels like a family, S says, but the cookouts remind him of his wretched institutional life and its failure of family. S is too fragile, tormented by the fact that he was never adopted out of foster care, and suffers belatedly from the discontinuities and disorganization of a life he lacks the psychic resources to remember, let alone rearticulate. We can't do anything for him, Kagla states, because he's not doing anything for himself. S leaves group therapy shortly afterwards. He's technically an MUS, or medically unexplained symptoms case, Kagla says. Yet look, everything is explicable. The back pain, the lack of post-op aftercare, the world's withholding of love or care for S. Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps Score argues that trauma produces actual physiological changes, including a recalibration of the brain's alarm system, an increase in stress hormone activity, and alterations in the system that filters relevant information from irrelevant. In van der Kolk's non-dualist interpretation, the traumatized state is redefined as a psychoneurosis as well as a physioneurosis, wherein changes in the brain compromise the embodied feeling of being alive. By the same token, the brain can be treated to better heal the body, its neuroplasticity utilized to make survivors feel more alive, more in control of the present. To restore the lost connection to their bodies, group members in St. Mary's Garden practice step-by-step skills to translate thinking to feeling, and what Kagla terms subjective emotional presence. They are encouraged to be aware of any positive experiences or sensations they may have. Kagla cites Bruce Ecker's opinions, he's the originator of coherence therapy, that while new learning always creates new circuits, it is only when new learning also unwires old learning that transformational change can happen. Van der Kolk, one of the world's foremost experts on traumatic stress, suggests 3 different pathways of trauma cure: talking and reconnecting, taking medicines that shut down hyperactive alarm systems, and finally allowing the body to have experiences that viscerally contradict the immobilization and powerlessness associated with traumatic states or traumatized states. At the therapeutic nursery at St. Mary's Garden, the 3rd most recuperative stage is associated with the fostering of an environmental imaginary and patterns of belonging to one's body and story that enable re-inhabitation in private and public spheres. The group participants have almost no insight into possible links between their physical symptoms and early emotional traumas and losses. Both therapists write this in the case notes. In order to address this traumatic dissociation, the therapy includes psychoeducation about the body in the form of grounding exercises and mindfulness. It sensitively addresses the self-stigmatization that patients suffer from, relatable to the internalization of prejudice, hopelessness, and a debilitating lack of confidence. One of the major tasks of the group work is to reverse this pattern and try to build resilience and capacity. As mentioned earlier, this is achieved primarily through creating a safe environment in the Horticultural group, training the members in principles of nonviolent communication and constructive criticism. Kagla mentions the Turkish word sohbet, a deep intrapsychic conversation between therapist and group and between fellow members, to explain the transformative connections this school of therapy aspires to. Sohbet is a form of social glue. Kagla cites a saying in Turkish that you can miss or postpone a ritual prayer, which has to be performed at certain intervals in the day, but you can't postpone a sohbet. Psychodynamic, emotion-focused, and experiential therapeutic methods are used in this form of group therapy to triangulate person and conflict, understand patterns of repression, and help patients become aware of inhibitions, avoidances, the devious workings of defenses and anxiety. Patients report the reliance on painkillers diminishing in the course of horticultural therapy. They are communicating better with family. They feel less bewildered in the face of symptoms. My last case study, Kagla presents the case study of a 57-year-old man, a shopkeeper with no record of mental illness, whose life takes a tragic turn following a road accident. His physical injury is not considered severe and he is discharged from hospital in a day. However, he deteriorates rapidly after this event, losing almost all his meager language skills. Withdrawn, forgetful, unable to leave the house, the only words he can muster are, "I do not know." At first, the group coordinators are not sure he should join the gardening project, but they invite him anyway and he agrees to come. As the weeks progress, he starts working actively in the gardening segment and begins to share stories of his life. He has small interactions with those around him. When I'm doing this, it means it's in the case notes, that exact language, and shows interest in their lives, asking questions from time to time. In 6 months, he's the most loved group member, Kaglar observes. 3 months after the gardening cohort disbands, the therapists have a review meeting with the man who arrives with his wife. They're smiling and happy. He says that he's working with his son now, going out, carrying on with life. His relationships are more fulfilling and relaxed, says the man, who during his first assessment could not string together answers and, case notes say, was not able to clear his nose when he cried. What happened to this man during this time in the group may seem mysterious, Kaglar tells me. The therapy in St. Mary's Garden is about a truth in parallax which restores functionality and capability in a world where historical truths kill. In Kaglar's assessment, the care and compassion provided by the group in a safe and non-judgmental environment helped this man to connect to the healing potential which we all have. This is Kaglar's reading, as he returns to the quotidian endurance of a care-filled life. While talking about the topologies of historical trauma, Freud had made a crucial distinction between castration trauma and repression and traumatic neuroses associated with accident victims and war veterans, which manifest less in repression than in debilitating symptoms of repetition. In psychoanalytic literature, whether it is Sigmund Freud's Nachtraglichkeit, deferred action, Laplanche's dual registers of traumatic relay between childish desires and adult lives, Pierre Janet's pathological automatisms through which fragments of unintegrated memories surface, or Van de Kolk's discontinuous cognition, trauma seems to signify splitting, interruption, repetition, and the sliding of signification. Trauma analysis involves translational acts which connect self with the other, autobiography with history, repetition with restitution. Van de Kolk highlights the shamanic role of the analyst in his own innovative treatment of PTSD. Sohbet, in my title, Sohbet in Kaglar's usage, is one such translational act. By providing a deep, intimate, and meaningful connection with another human being, we hope that we have created more opportunities for Sohbet in their lives, Kaglar and Berilgen say. While Van de Kolk finds narrative, helping victims of trauma find the words to describe what has happened, meaningful, he says it is not enough, usually. According to Van de Kolk, the aim of trauma cure is not simply generating a narrative of belated experiencing, nor is it predicated on the temporal dyad of speaker and listener. The therapists have discussed here acquiesce to the sober realization that people trapped in chronic poverty need physical rehabilitation into collaborative and socially dialogic modes of living more than what we understand as narrative-oriented therapy. The chapter that this talk is drawn from is titled The Analyst as Muse of History in Disaster Zones. What I mean by muse of history is this treatment, which is not only interpretive, but fosters a fledgling sovereignty based on being and mattering in time. The group brings some organization to my life, like being on time, one of the participants had said in her responses to the questionnaire. I asked Kaglar about the adaptations to the program during the pandemic. This cohort of participants is now split into 2 groups, a yearly horticultural one facilitated by Kaglar and a 20-week psychotherapy group run by Berilgen. I'm sure these are beginning to become in-person now. COVID-19 restrictions had stopped face-to-face treatment, so they were then offered group therapy on a video platform provided by the Tavistock. Until that time that their green-fingered charges could return to St. Mary's Garden, Selchuk and Berilgen sent them kits with seeds and compost to continue gardening in the balconies of their flats or tiny back gardens. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ankhi. And we now want to just take a bit of time, 25 minutes or so, to reflect a bit more on some of the material that Ankhi has opened up from Unseen Cities. So I'll reintroduce Professor Ian Robertson, who will be in conversation with Professor Ankhi Mukherjee for a few minutes.
Thank you very much indeed, Ankhi. Such a fascinating small excerpt of your book, because you're equally fascinating when you're talking about slums of Mumbai and New York and indeed Sierra Leone. You know, talking some of the literature about this, such a vast kind of range of subjects and topics. So you could easily one could easily get lost in it. But behind it all is this. You know, I was yesterday at the Centre for Forced Migration. There's a new centre in Trinity that opened up yesterday. There were 80 million refugees in the world, and I think you in your book, you said in terms of people living in slums is about 1 billion. And the mental anguish. It's not just, you know, you tend to think poor people need physical things, but I think what you've done is you've really brought to the forward the key, possibly the key thing is the mental distress, particularly the trauma that tends to go with all of these deprivations, and how to deal with that and cope with that. So that's really, and I know you were our mutual acquaintance. You know much better than me, Vikram Patel from Goa, who was in London. He's a fantastic advocate of barefoot mental health, if you like, and has done some wonderful randomized studies of that in Goa, and now he's in Harvard. That he recognizes the power of this whole topic you're covering. So I loved your account of the horticultural therapy group. You know, I can just imagine the people in that group. I trained in the Institute of Psychiatry in London as a clinical psychologist in the behavioural tradition, and the first cognitive behavioural therapy was coming in then. The term was coined during my time there, and the psychotherapy unit. Psychoanalytic psychotherapy unit in the Maudsley. Famously, really, most of its clients were staff of the Maudsley, social workers mainly. That's what I heard. And who went there for year upon year upon year, and it's no surprise And then when I went to Cambridge. The small psychotherapy unit there closed down, basically because it's not viable to offer the kind of analysis that Freud offered to. Nor is it necessarily any more effective than the briefer types of therapy you talk about, but it's extremely interesting to hear someone who's not in the business as I was. I'm no longer, but I was in the business of providing therapy, and recognizing that just your description of these people in the horticultural group, the medically unexplained symptoms, the headaches, the strange outbursts of temper. You know, I was never equipped to understand or deal with these things in the Maudsley. You know, it was an impoverished language, you know, that I was trained in to try and understand these things. So I'm stuck between this kind of two things, and then but you're incredibly sympathetic to There's a wonderful quote you give from Freud about the gold of psychoanalysis will have to yield to the copper of prescription, is it, or something that you really will have to become kind of didactic or prescriptive because basically the world can't afford psychoanalysis. So what is the challenge is, what can you offer for these millions of people who are suffering? Here's me talking all the time for that long question. I'm kind of setting the ground for you to I guess, say to me, look, we have to discover ways like this, actually. And how do we bring this to the slums of Mumbai? So that's, sorry for that long introduction, but...
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for reading the book. It's a tremendous honor to have you read the book. And I'm so incredibly, I feel gratified and very humbled, really, that you have connected with the argument in this way, and you find it, it has some merit. And one of the things that I have now, this book took quite a long time to write. It took nearly, I started thinking about it when I was writing my second book, which is called What is a Classic? And it's probably one of the ways in which we survive a book, where we think about the thing to come next. And I've been talking to so many NGOs, public sector mental hospitals, psychiatrists, psychoanalysts, and one of the things that connected the different examples I've used is people who are trained in psychotherapeutic psychoanalysis or psychoanalytically oriented psychotherapy, but who are also not afraid to innovate, who are, and there's an Indian term I use in the book called jugaad, which means it's a hack, which doesn't mean you're taking a shortcut, but it means you are making the best use, you're making a strategic sort of transformation of an existing machinery to make do, and there is an example from the Horticultural group I didn't sort of discuss, which is about, again, another sort of very difficult case involving a Kurdish woman, and she's invited to the Horticultural group, and she suffers from anxiety, and she starts thinking that there's no, anxieties, as we know, are not always rational or logical, and she thinks, someone's trying to sort of, defile her religion by putting pig manure in the garden, in the sort of, the garden plot. And what the psychotherapists do is, instead of sort of, trying to talk her out of this sort of completely baseless anxiety that she has, they actually go to an imam. And they get the imam to talk to her and say, don't worry about this, they're not trying to hurt you, they're here to help you, they're very sensitive to your religious restrictions, and there is no pig manure. And this I would describe as a jugaad or a hack. That they're not kind of, they don't have the time, they don't have the resources to carry on one-on-one therapy with this woman where they can sort of, in a way, disabuse her of this anxiety or this irrational fear. But they kind of think that the imam's, the religious leader's word would be valuable, and they go out of their way to get that. And she starts connecting with the gardening group. And this is very, very true of the case studies. And as you said, I don't have a clinical background, and most people think that I'm very interested in psychoanalysis because of the sort of torturous, and torturous sometimes narratives that psychoanalysis spawns. Freud himself was deeply influenced by literature when he was writing up his case studies. But a very humbling thing for me was understanding that narrative is not everything needs to be a story. These are snippets. Some of them are just kind of scattered speculation. Some of them are this kind of telos we have constructed in narratives where everything has to be very end-oriented and goal-oriented. That's not the case with these case studies because of the lack of time the analysts have in treating them. Almost all of them are resigned to the fact that this is not going to last for very long, but they have this open door policy that the kind of the client or the patient can come back at will. But they don't think this is something that'll be sustainable over time, because it's really sort of very ad hoc, propter hoc, thinking on your feet with these psychodynamic principles to provide some relief to symptoms which have debilitated people for years, if not months.
I was struck the other day just listening to the terrible tragedy in Canadian Indigenous people of the stabbing and the account of the complete demoralization of a culture and the alcoholism and the drug addiction, and just how can it be that a culture of that kind can transmit itself and demoralize hundreds of thousands of people and leave them stripped of, I guess, a sense of well-being and of many of them, self-worth. So, it strikes me that particularly displaced people and immigrants and migrants, I mean, that sense of dislocation and that loss of that sense of who you are must be at the core of an awful lot of their experiences. I'm wondering what your experience was of comparing that to, say, and you talk about Catherine Poo's book that was in the Mumbai or Kolkata,
Yes.
Mumbai slum,
Yes.
next to the airport.
Yes.
Very interesting, and you contrast that positively against the slumdog millionaire narrative. This notion of, oh, poor them, these poor people who have to do something, that attitude. Is there a difference, if you like, between the psychic distress or problems of the people, living in the slums? You mentioned in your book that the degree of mental distress was correlated with the amount of contact with rats
Yes.
that people had. That basic, but it's far from castration anxiety as you can get, or maybe not. But anyway, so that's the question about these different types of misery and different types of adversity and poverty.
That's a really wonderful question, and actually most people in slums are migrants. They're migrants from villages to the big city, and they are exactly the surplus population the city needs, but the city also abuses. And two of the examples I've used in the book, Pukar, from where that particular study is taken, these are non-registered slums, which means they're sort of, in a way, the kind of most deprived of slums. They don't even have, they're non-registered, they're squatter slums. People have just occupied a space. In the case of Catherine Poo's book, which is, kind of narrative non-fiction, she's talking about this surplus space the international airports have, which, poor people have kind of, squatted on. And by non-registered means the government owes them nothing. No electricity, no running water. So they're really extraordinarily deprived, but these are very much the people whose recycling businesses are keeping the city tick on. The city relies on this particular demographic and the question of migrancy is very important here, because as you said, with indigenous populations, a similar kind of violence has been done to these groups. They are away from villages, they're away from, they're sort of divorced from certain structures of belief and faith and community. Many of them are single. There's a horrendous sort of, rape case in Delhi. But one of the facts that sort of was very telling to me was that these boys were all migrants, and they were not to at all justify any form of violence against women, but they were migrants, and they were very poor migrants in the city, who the only human contact they had was through pornography, or this was the only sort of sexual contact they had. And so it's very important to kind of see in the migrant also, that particular, in the slum dweller, that history of migrancy. That, they've come to the city looking for a better life, and this is what they have, and they're disconnected from family, community, village. So many of the NGOs that work with these communities actually try to kind of, I'm working with the Banyan in Chennai, which is one of the biggest sort of mental health initiatives in India, and they routinely, when they're working with, let's say, the homeless population, which is their demographic, they routinely connect with the temples or the mosques or the gurdwaras around them, because they feel that this is not something that can be solved by a medically trained professional alone, that you have to sort of in a way tap into the other support structures that this particular homeless person is drawing on. So yes, the way in which I connect this is that I do see that alienation as sociological. It's not just psychological, it's sociological, and to some extent the book is trying to say that they cannot be divorced, that our well-being depends on the ill-being of the slum dweller.
Yes.
You see this in India, everybody has domestic help, and we have this sort of myth that the domestic help actually is sort of a slightly more disadvantaged version of ourselves, when most of them are actually slum dwellers, they're actually slum dwellers. But we can't possibly, on an everyday basis, reconcile with the fact that, the person who's cooking for us or who's looking after our child or walking our dog actually has absolutely no recourse, even if they work double the number of hours we do, to the lifestyle we have. So, there's this sort of, almost kind of hysterical blindness toward the extreme deprivation of the very people who are keeping the neoliberal economy going. And so, definitely this my book is trying to say that they're both together, that we have to take responsibility, because my well-being and my success is intricated with the kind of systemic failure of provision of care toward a certain population.
It's very interesting you mentioned the caste system in India. One of your cases is a woman who comes in great distress, but the problem is her husband's a policeman, or I think it was, and his problem is he's dissatisfied with her level of education, and so it's a kind of mindset. You say, how can one deal with this woman's distress given a structure where no matter what she does, she can't repair this relationship? But how does one deal with the sociology, if you like, of mental distress? Because psychoanalysis and psychotherapy is largely and individually focused, and so often criticized by political and sociology people about locating the problem in the individual rather than the social structures. So you're navigating that tricky space. So how do you?
No, again, that's another sort of. I'd love to answer that question. So one of the things about the free clinic movement, and this is probably why I keep going back to Freud. I think he's such an extraordinarily pragmatic thinker, even while he's looking to Greek tragedy to devise sort of very kind of viable ways of how we function in the 20th century. And Freud kind of anticipated this for the free clinic, that a city psychoanalyst is not going to be able to go to the last mile community. So this relay of specialism, which is something I've traced in the book, that a psychoanalyst or a psychiatrist comes and trains the psychotherapist, who trains the social worker, who goes into the community and takes corporation workers to go back into the community. So there has to be that relay. I can't, with the way I speak, the way I dress, I cannot go to the slums and suddenly start talking to people about their distress. So I'm very reliant again on these barefoot researchers, who have been trained. They've been trained in non-judgmental listening. They have been. Another very, very important thing I've traced throughout the book is language. That you're speaking the language. So in Pukar, for instance, people speak Marathi, they speak Tamil, they speak Hindi, they speak Bengali. So they take volunteers who speak these languages. And so there has to be that kind of connection made. Yeah. And one of the reasons the horticultural therapy works with the Tavistock, Tavistock is the biggest institution for a certain kind of socialist form of mental health care, but one of the most successful programs is where Turkish therapists are looking after Turkish clients, so that you're speaking the same language, and that definitely is an extremely important thing. In the Indian context, of course, there are so many different languages, so about using people from the community, but also training. So, one of the NGOs I've written about, Samadhana, training people, training white-collar professionals. Many of them are, sort of well-meaning professors, kind of, social workers, etc., want to give back to the community, but training them in sort of expedient listening techniques. And, so if somebody, one of the case studies that didn't go into my book, I don't know why, because I really love to talk about it, is a farmer comes and says, I keep dreaming of a Red Bull. And, there are many ways in which you can talk about it, and the person in question, the lay counsellor, who's trained in counselling but actually has no clinical background, says, we have no time to go to this person's childhood, and you can't think of the Red Bull as phallus or as father, and says that what is it that is worrying you so much these days? And he says, we haven't had good rains, the crops have failed, and I'm worried about not being able to pay dowry for my daughter. And then the woman says, the counselor says, do you think the Red Bull could be your fear of insolvency or your fear of sort of bankruptcy? And he thinks about it, and the next day he says, I've stopped dreaming of the Red Bull. Mm-hmm. Now it sounds childishly simple, but that's the point about that connection, that sohbet, that face-to-face, that actually the person knows what is wrong, you just have to return that truth to them.
Yeah.
And you could analyze this and you could do this over time, but there is no time. This person doesn't have the bus fare that's needed to come from a village to Bangalore or Bengaluru to have a sustained conversation. So you just kind of get to the point and you try to help what you think is bothering the person.
It's a fantastic example, and perhaps maybe it's not a bad thing there is no time, because there is the focus on transference as being that you have to kind of essentially recapitulate early relationships in your relationship with the therapist. That's a dangerous business and can result in real dependency and real problems, and hence the Maudsley Clinic just having the same patients year after year, and that's why they closed down the NHS psychotherapy clinics largely, because Freud had insights of genius, and so Peter Fonagy, for instance, who's the head of the Anna Freud Centre, he's developed this mentalizing base, which is extracting some of the really fine ideas, but not believing that you need to go into early childhood experiences, not because you don't have time, because maybe they're not relevant anymore.
Right.
Maybe the rats and the relationships with your policeman husband, maybe they're the critical things that you have to deal with, and what you're describing is, to me, the kind of core of this thing what you call psychomattering, which I hadn't realized, understood. But when you said being and mattering in time, making people feel as if they matter in time and space, being, and that's what's missing in a lot of people, millions of people. So I don't want to speak some more, I'll let you answer that, but
I think this is where the ground base of my constantly thinking that what connects all these clients is actually poverty. It was very helpful for me to kind of in a way decode and recode these examples, that ultimately their goal is to restore capacity, and this has a sort of somewhat, to some extent, and I write about this in the book, that the categorization of mental illness as a form of disability has actually worked to the advantage of poor populations in India, for instance, because then you kind of think, it's a very big population, it needs its population to be up and working, but if they're really disabled by mental illness, that means that they need help to be just restored to the workforce. Now, to reduce human beings to ciphers of a neoliberal economy is not ideal, but at least this means that there is more government health interventions in the kind of incapacitation produced by mental illness, and that's been a very big thing for sort of developing economies, the categorization of mental illness as a form of disability, and and routinely I think so it was very helpful for me to keep this in mind, that one of the key goals was getting this person out of their house, leaving them less moribund. This was one of the things that came up in the case studies in the Horticultural therapy group, that just getting out of the house to go to the garden was helpful for people who had fallen off the map, and they were actually not able to explain what was wrong with them. They were not able to explain why they needed the benefits, why they needed to be supported by the state, because they couldn't explain what was wrong with them.
Thank you. Look, I'm aware of time. Can I just say thank you very much indeed. Real delight talking to you. Thank you for this. It's very important.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Ian and Ankhi. We're not going to record the questions, but we would maybe take 5 minutes if our speakers don't mind, because I think there may be some people who would like to ask a question or make a comment on what we've been